Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast from Bruegel, the Brussels-based think tank specialised in economics and economic policy. I'm Bryn Watkins, and pleased to bring you today's episode. We're going to have a conversation about EU-China relations, and I'm joined here by two guests. Robin Niblett is the director of Chatham House in London. Hello, Robin.
Hello, Bryn.
And Alicia García-Herrero is a senior scholar here at Bruegel. She's an expert on Asia and usually based in Hong Kong. Hola, Alicia.
Hola, Bryn.
Thank you to both of you for joining us. Now, you're here in Brussels for the launch of a new report, EU-China Economic Relations 2025, Building a Common Future. This is a hefty piece of work, and it's the result of an 18-month study by 4 partner organisations: Bruegel, Chatham House, the China Centre for International Economic Exchanges, and the Institute of Global Economics and Finance at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. You're mainly going to talk about some of the findings and policy suggestions in the report, but do feel free to branch out into wider questions about the relationship between Europe and China, because this is certainly a very hot topic. Now, you're the experts on this, so I'm going to leave you to it for the next 10 minutes. We're looking forward to a good conversation about the report, the work that went into it, and the future of EU-China relations. But to get you started, I'm just going to throw one question at Alicia, and after that, Robin, you can jump in and off you go. So, Alicia, for someone who follows the debate about Europe and China but isn't really an expert, what do you think is the most surprising finding in this new report?
I guess the most surprising finding is that we managed to write a report, in 4 hands, with 4 hands, actually 8 hands, so 4 people, 4 different think tanks with very different ideas, and we really managed to come up with some very, very cooperative conclusions on China-EU relations. And that's the really interesting part of the report, how to get to points where we see our win-win solutions to our daily issues, which are not easy. And that is by itself already a very big achievement.
Let me back Alicia's kind of key surprise or most unexpected element up as well, because although the theory of talking about EU-China relations is always attractive, the old power, the EU, the new rising power, China, the 2 countries that at least espouse in theory the future of multilateralism, that do not claim to be as exceptional as the United States does. And of course the Trump moment, where this fear that which happened during the course, I might add, of the report, as did Brexit, the idea that the United States is pulling back potentially gave an additional contextual push for why EU and China would think about a closer economic relationship. But I think the reason I share Alicia's conclusion is that we also coincided this report with the emergence of a more tense relationship, should we say, economically, between China and EU. The disappointment on the Chinese side of the EU not backing China's market economy status. As we've heard today, the EU trying to coordinate the capacity to restrict Chinese investment in areas of high interest or security for the EU as a whole and for EU economies. And a European business that's just a bit worried about where the Chinese economy is going. And Alicia, wouldn't you, this is one thing I think came up in so many of the discussions, was the sense that it should be this moment of strategic opportunity, but in fact, we had to, as the 4 institutions, overcome some pretty high levels of caution, would be a nice word to use, on the European side. And of course, on the Chinese side, they've got plenty of challenges of their own. Yes, and you're in Hong Kong. Wouldn't you say that it looked theoretically like this should be the perfect time to do this study? In practice, I think it revealed, of course, a lot of the tensions and mismatches.
Yeah, I fully agree. And notwithstanding those tensions and mismatches, we managed to come up with some cooperative ideas, perhaps not as much on the issues that are the usual suspects, i.e. investment and trade, frankly. I think that's where, no matter how much we could push, we still see that major differences in economic models make it hard to move forward. We hope we will move forward, but we really can't point out really in the report the way. We don't have like a strategic steps that we need to take, frankly speaking. Instead, on infrastructure, on environment, I think there we even more, global cooperation. I think there we do find that it might be easier.
Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting, yeah?
Yeah.
The core is hard, but many other things that are becoming increasingly important, though, are easier. That's where the win-win is clear in our report. And I guess, again, this is about old Europe, new China, yeah? Trade and investment is where we thought we had a comparative advantage.
Yes,
That's where
exactly.
we thought we would be happy with China. And that's where we are not happy so far.
Yeah.
We have a trade deficit with China. In my humble opinion, it's not going to go away anytime soon. And we actually possibly already this year have more inflow of, yes, surely of financing, which is great, but Europe doesn't need financing. We have a current account surplus. So the idea that we should be extremely happy with M&A deals is not necessarily the case anymore. I mean, let's face it. And that is why it's so hard, because what we want is our companies, or what Europe wants, I mean, is our companies, which actually happen to operate in a shrinking market, let's face it, have access to a very large and growing market. And that's not necessarily what we're discussing. So that is why it's so hard there in trade and investment, I believe.
Because in a way there's a trade-off being proposed, one feels, from the Chinese side, which is let more of our investment into the EU, let's create sort of collaborative companies, and then you can come in big way back into China. Whereas we've been looking at a slightly more traditional model where we're expecting China's market to keep opening up in the investment and now in the services side, as they appear to do on a lot of the manufacturing side, where the state-owned element has declined. But I think what we're starting to find is there's a different deal on offer, which is, the levels of Chinese foreign direct investment in the EU, although growing, are remarkably low if you compare it to the size of the overall trading relationship. And one of the interesting stats in the report, the EU-US trade relationship, goods and services, is around 600 billion, 650 billion a year. It's not that much lower between China and the EU, but the mutual stock of US or EU investment in each other's markets, built up over a long time, admittedly, is over 2.5 trillion. Whereas you're talking maybe about, 40 billion of Chinese in the EU, and not much more over 130 or something in the opposite direction. So, of course, from a Chinese perspective, and maybe from a European, you think, well, gosh, investment must start to follow this big trading relationship. But under what terms and in what conditions? And this is why, again, the EU-China relationship right now within Brussels, as I understand it, is principally about the bilateral investment treaty.
That's right.
And that's meant to be number one. We won't talk about FTAs till investment is done. And yet, as Alicia pointed out, this is the area that really reveals the different structures of our political economies. In the investment space, you get into the real differences of the role of the state in managing the economy, as seen in China, as compared to the EU. And again, I think, that was one of the real spaces.
I feel terrible for interrupting this exciting discussion. It just shows how much there is in the report and what a lot went into the work behind putting it together. But I'm afraid this is going to be our moment to close the conversation. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, Robin.
Pleasure.
And thank you, Alicia, for coming over from Hong Kong to be with us. And finally, thanks to you out there for listening to The Sound of Economics. If you're interested in more Bruegel work about China, you can find this new report in a range of blogs and papers on our website at www.bruegel.org. Although, of course, you should check out the Chatham House website as well.
It's all there.
And I hope you'll join us again for The Sound of Economics. Until next time.